All right, welcome everybody. This is Anthony Rusomano, again, your host from Futureology, your college and career coordinator. And I want to welcome you to class 4 tonight. For those of you who looked at the syllabus, you'll know tonight is about the reading on the SAT or the ACT. We've got Alan Polito again, who actually did our session this past week on the grammar portion. So again, we'd like to welcome Alan back to our district. Couple announcements for those of you who are just joining us. A couple reminders. Your student folder has access now to the first 3 videos. So if you want to go in there, if you missed a session, we're welcoming you for the first time. If not, you missed 1 or 2, go back to the recordings. You can catch up on your own. Okay, you don't have to go in order. They're all going to be different subjects covered through all our sessions. We'll have another session next Sunday, where Travis is going to come on board, okay? So take a look at the syllabus if you want to see what's going to be, what we will work on. For tonight, again, Q&A. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A, and we'll either answer it, I'll answer it myself, or I'll have Alan answer it while he's live. If you have any other questions, you can also, or comments, you can throw them in the chat, but again, the Q&A is the best. We'll go about an hour and a half tonight like we normally do, and keep the questions coming. They've been really great over the last few weeks. In the meantime, I'm going to turn my video off and turn it over to Alan. If you have any other questions about the program of the class, again, you can reach me at ajrusomano@capousd.org. It would be in your syllabus. It'll be in the forms online in the student folder. Other than that, again, Alan, I'd like to welcome Alan, and I'm going to turn it over to him. And Alan, you're on, buddy.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Anthony. Let me just do a couple of things here. One, make sure my sound is okay. So, Anthony, are we good?
You are good.
Okay, and then let me share my screen here. Let me just kind of go into the full mode there. Okay, share the screen. And is it up?
It is correct? Up. I see it. It says math.
Okay, then we're in trouble.
Okay. It says reading.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much, Anthony. Thanks to you for inviting me again to teach for the second time in this webinar series. And also, of course, thank you and welcome to everybody, all the students from Capo Unified School District. It's a Sunday night, so I'm sure this is a really exciting thing for you guys to do besides anything else. As you can see clearly, the title for tonight's lesson is reading, and I'm going to cover both the ACT and SAT. There are definitely some subtle differences between the two, but at its core, kind of like the grammar lesson that I taught about a week ago, they're fundamentally about the same kind of stuff. My contact information is, of course, up on the very first slide, so if you guys have any questions, even after this presentation is over, or if you are watching this as the recording, feel free to reach out to me one way or the other. Brief information about myself. I've been in test preparation and education for 20 years, and I'm the owner of Polito Prep. And if you guys, again, have any questions about that, feel free to contact me. Okay, so just like my other webinar, I wanted to talk very briefly about the test structure, just so that we are all on the same page regarding the reading sections or reading tests on either of these exams. So, first of all, on the ACT, the reading test is going to be a 35-minute section with 40 questions, and the result or the score that you would get is from a minimum of 1 point to a maximum of 36 points. As a reminder, that would become part of the average or your composite score of the ACT out of 4 different sections, or as they call it, 4 different tests. For the SAT, the reading test is quite a bit longer. It's 65 minutes for 52 questions there. And your score is actually integrated with a writing and language test to create a 3-digit score ranging from 200 points to 800 points. And of course, that is then paired up with a math score within the same range, so that you have a total score range of 400 to 1600 points. Okay. Furthermore, into the test structure, these are the things that they have in common with each other for both SAT and ACT. The passage or passages, sometimes you have 2. The passage is printed first and then followed by the questions, and you have 4 answer choices for each question that you are given. Instructions say that you must choose the best answer for each question. A tip that I want to give you guys in this page is that the best answer may not be exactly what you think it should be. You must learn what the test writers deem best. And frankly, this is part of the larger struggle for the reading sections for both of these exams. Sometimes we actually find ourselves teaching to our students that you are not necessarily even picking the best answer as they want to describe it. You might actually be picking what we would call the least worst, okay? And so we want to make sure that you guys understand that we absolutely are aware that reading is a very subjective thing. I think we can all agree on that. You know, the challenge is that if you compare it to something like mathematics or even grammar, okay, those have very specific and strict rules and equations and facts that are non-negotiable. So for example, in math, if you are asked to find the area of a circle, you must use the formula pi r squared. That's, again, not negotiable. If you are in grammar and you are trying to determine if the subject and verb have the correct type of agreement, or if you're trying to determine if the verb has the right type of tense, that's non-negotiable as well. Excuse me. But for reading, a lot of these things are negotiable, or at least subjective and subject to interpretation. So their challenge was, of course, designing a test that could withstand the pressure of everybody, millions and millions of people taking the exam and not being able to justify that what the test writers wrote was incorrect. So using that understanding is how we will guide you throughout the reading section for both exams. Okay. So here is just a very quick view of what the test structure, of course, looks like. And let me see here, annotate, where is that thing? Highlight, spotlight, there it is, okay. So just, of course, over here on the left-hand side is your passage, and on the right-hand side are your questions, I should say. Now, the SAT and ACT can sometimes sort of change the way that they look slightly, depending on how long the passage happens to be. But generally speaking, this is kind of what you're looking at. Most of the time, actually, the passage will appear in the first page or page and a half, followed by the actual questions themselves, okay? Now, another tip that I want to highlight for you guys here is the fact that you don't have to necessarily follow the order of passages. And that is one of the huge benefits of taking an exam that is still pencil and paper based. Many other tests you will encounter, especially as you proceed past college level, will be computerized. So you don't have this type of option. For the ACT and SAT currently, you have that ability. Now, why is that something that would be practical or even helpful for many of you? It's because each of you should have a general idea of what types of topics, what types of passages you tend to be more excited about, and which ones kind of bore you a little bit. And you can use that knowledge to set the order of passages that you actually encounter. So instead of just being stuck to the chronological order given to you by the test every time you take it, feel free to scan ahead just very, very quickly. And if you happen to know that you are better at history, for example, or fiction or science-based passages, then you should absolutely attack those first. The reason that that's a helpful technique is that by attacking the passages that you are better at, and in theory the ones that you like more, of course, you are then able to spread out your time a little bit better. If you stick to the order that they've given it to you simply by the pages as they're presented and printed in front of you, then what that means is that if you are engaging a passage that you do not like, it is much more likely for you to get bogged down. It is much more likely for you to be discouraged. It is much more likely for you to waste time, especially as you're making your way through a topic that you are not very comfortable with. And that also is a disadvantage to the rest of your attitude and your momentum for the exam. Right? If you feel like you're starting off very poorly, that can easily affect the way that you perform for the rest of the 4-hour exam. Hence, remember, you don't have to follow the order of passages, especially if you are able to identify which topics are better for you. Now, if any of you feel like asking, well, which topics are easier, Well, there's no way to answer that. That would be like asking me, you know, which ice cream flavor is better, vanilla or chocolate ice cream. I can't answer that for you. You're going to have to determine that by yourself and then apply it using the strategy that I just mentioned. Okay. So one of my favorite things to actually describe before I even discuss how to attack the specific sections is to talk about typical testing behavior, okay? So this is something that I like to spotlight as well because it allows you to identify some of the things that you might be doing and you may not even be aware of doing, and I'm pointing them out so that you can understand which behaviors to kind of stay away from. Now, again, reading is very subjective, so everybody approaches it in a slightly different manner. That not only is it affected by your natural reading ability, it's also affected by your natural comprehension ability. It's also affected by the fact whether you've studied formally or informally for this test before. Undoubtedly, there are some of you listening to me right now who have had classes or tutors or read something on the internet or bought some books and are following those techniques as well. So it's impossible to just paint everybody with one paintbrush, but I'll try to highlight some of the things that we've seen over and over again from typical testers. And these are usually people who have not had any kind of formal tutoring or training before. So the first type, I'll just kind of put it as a title, I'll call it read for a book report or reading for a book report. And for me, what that means is that there are some people who, when they first sit down to take one of these exams and they read the passages, their natural inclination is to read everything and approach it with the same mindset that they are going to be asked about it as if it were for a book report or some very detailed type of process. So they're reading it as if they want to either try to memorize the whole thing or that they're trying to comprehend everything about it. Usually, guys, students who have a bit of a perfectionist streak usually fall for this trap. So they spend as much time as they feel comfortable with in reading just one passage at a time and making sure that they truly understand every nook and cranny about it, which is not a good thing, particularly for your time. Okay, so it's one type of tester. You don't really need to read every single word, and for sure, you definitely do not need to understand every single word that is given to you. Okay, and we'll dive a little bit more into the correct techniques there, but that's one type of typical tester. Another one would be a person who's basically doing the questions mostly from memory. Sometimes it's just sheer laziness. Sometimes it's just lack of knowledge that they should actually be flipping back and forth. And so for some testers out there, when they sit down to actually engage every problem one at a time, the way that they try to answer a lot of those questions is to simply do it from memory and kind of just think it back to what they just read. Obviously, there are some lacking things about that particular process, and so again, I will be teaching you guys a better way to do these sections. And then you have the student who is doing the questions in chronological order. This is very similar to the tester who may not realize that instead of having to stick to reading the same order of passages every single time, you can actually skip around and start on passage 3 versus passage 1 versus passage 4 versus passage 2. But for many of you, what you actually set out to do is if you've got questions 1 through 10 in front of you in the next 2 pages, your mindset is, I'm just going to do questions 1 through 10. And that's not necessarily the best way to approach it either, because you want to work towards your own order of difficulty, if you will. You're trying to establish your own strengths and leverage the things that you are much more comfortable with. So this is a reminder that you do not have to do the questions in the same order that they are printed and displayed in front of you. You can absolutely skip around, but the one thing to, of course, remember is that if you're going to choose to skip around, make sure you don't forget to put down an answer choice and leave any questions blank. If you've listened to the first parts, the first lectures that I believe Anthony gave before, you never, ever physically leave a question blank on the SAT or ACT. So since both of them basically act the same at this point, never ever leave any question blank. So just don't forget to put something down if you're going to choose to skip around. Okay? Okay. So part of the challenge of the reading tests is your ability to learn how to speak like the ACT and the SAT test writers do. Okay? It's definitely a language of its own, and it's part of what we would call standardized testing language. Okay? Kind of like how math is a language of its own, science has its own language, standardized testing has its own language as well. So let me show you what I mean. If somebody were to ask what we would consider a normal question from a normal person, and you wanted to know where your family and you were going to have, your dinner tonight, you might simply say, "Where are we eating dinner tonight?" There are many other ways to say that, but let's just take this one, okay? So you might say, "Mom, Dad, where are we eating dinner tonight?" And everybody pretty much understands what that's saying. Excuse me. Now, for the ACT and SAT test writers, they hate that question for many, many reasons. Number one, it's too simple, okay? They don't like simple on this test. Number two, it's too short. They also don't like short questions very much. And number three, which is related to this first two, it is way too easy, okay? They are in the business of offering a test that needs to be difficult, okay? Now, why would that matter to them? Well, think of it this way. First of all, one of the purposes of these tests is to actually assign some type of number to each of you, which we would call an ACT score or an SAT score. That serves one purpose in college admissions because it is very difficult to compare each of you simply by your background, simply by what you have to say in your college essays, even simply by your grades or your GPA, right? Grades and GPA vary significantly from school to school and even from student to student, even from class to class within the same school. So they use it as a way to assign a number that everybody can relate to. Another reason is, of course, the fact that if you take these exams and you're paying just shy of $60 when you take it the first time, what happens if you don't get the score that you want? You take it again. And every single time, you're paying just south of $60 every single time. And there's nothing sweeter for a test writing organization than to have you pay money every single time to do that. Okay? So they are in the business of making this much more difficult for you to comprehend. So how would they do that, especially for something as subjective as reading? Instead of asking, "Where are we eating dinner tonight?" they would change that question. And it would sound something like this. "The problem with the venue for tonight's meal is that the momentous occasion shall take place at blah, 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 blah." A might say In-N-Out Burger. B might say Pizza Hut. C might say Olive Garden. And D might say Albert Tacos. Okay? It doesn't really matter what the options are. But I want you guys to sit here and appreciate how different these two questions look, but how similar they are in exactly what they are asking. Okay? So the first thing is you need to recognize that they're doing this on purpose. The next thing is, what do you do about it? So this next slide, I teach you how to translate ACT and SAT speak to something that is more human. Okay? I've given you guys a couple of different, two different scenarios here. So the first one, okay, says, of course, the passage as a whole can primarily be characterized as the narrator's blah, 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 blah. 4 answer choices there. This looks and sounds just like a typical question on either test type. These are the 3 most powerful words I can teach you to be more successful on the reading sections. What, why, how. These are the 3 words that you can choose from in order to rephrase these questions that you see on the SAT and ACT. And in fact, I don't call them questions. Look at number 1 and even look at 21. Do you see any question marks there? If it doesn't have a question mark, it's not a question. What they mostly are incomplete statements. There are a few, of course, that do have questions, and that's fine. But for many of them, they're incomplete statements. So we don't want to engage them in that fashion because, frankly, we don't talk like that, right? Imagine after school if you were hanging out with your friends and you said, you gave an example which is saying that, you know, Mr. Carr gave us such heavy homework to do over spring break because he feels that A, B, C, and D. If you were trying to be weird or funny, you might get away with that one time. But if you kept talking like that, you'd have no friends very, very quickly. Okay? So we use one of these three and notice a couple of things. First of all, what, why, and how are very open-ended questions. That's the style that they use. Every once in a while, it'll be like a who or a when or a where. But that's very, very rare on this type of exam. So it's what, why, how. Very open-ended. So in the first example, instead of accepting this incomplete statement that says the passage as a whole can primarily be characterized as narrators, blah, 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 you might say, how can the passage be characterized? So let me expand on that a little bit, guys. Number one, you have to practice this skill. I've met way too many students in 20 years of tutoring who will sit there, listen to what I say, smile and nod their heads, and then never actually practice it. Or even worse, keep it in the back of their minds and then try to do it the morning of the real test for the first time. That is the worst way you could do this, okay? So what you should do is, if you're going to use this strategy, this technique, practice it over and over again, especially when you're doing practice problems for ACT and SAT. At the beginning, it will slow you down because I actually make my own students write out every single one of their rephrased statements. But the reason they do that is so that it can be second nature by the time they take the real thing. When they take the real thing, they do not rewrite the whole sentence. That would be way too slow. But they still write the first word, what or why or how. Number 21. The authors would likely attribute the differences in gift giver and recipient mean appreciation as represented in the graph to, I don't even know what that's saying at all, right? I don't have the passage next to me, but practicing this skill will allow me to shorten it. It will also allow me to simplify what it is. And frankly, it will also allow me to understand what it's asking a little bit better. So what might I say? What would the authors attribute their differences to? Okay. Now you can make that a little bit longer. You can make that a little bit shorter. It actually just depends. What I've found is that the more students practice this technique, then the shorter you can make the questions and still have it make sense to you especially, okay? I just want you guys to take a look at this and compare my versions in red versus the original versions. Which ones are easier to think about? Which ones are easier to keep in your mind, right? And when you're flipping back and forth, or when you're looking back and forth from right to left and left to right, I also know that for many of you, you experience temporary amnesia. Let's be real, right? So what that means is you think you know what it's asking before you had this technique. You go back to the passage, and then your brain says, I forgot the question. So what do? You go back to the original statement, and then you do the whole thing over and over again. It's this ridiculous dance that many of you go through, and I'm sure many of you are nodding your heads right now going, that's exactly what happens when I look at the reading stuff, okay? So practice this particular technique. By the way, there's one more benefit to this whole thing. By giving you something physical to actually do on what is effectively the most boring part of our already very long test, then I keep you more awake. And if I can keep most of you more awake on the longest, most boring part of this test, then your scores will go up. When you compare reading to something like grammar or even science or even the math, of course, most of the time your pencils are moving because you're putting notes down, especially in math and then secondarily science. Or if it's a calculator section, then you are punching things into your calculator. On the reading, most of you look like this, okay? Or maybe it's just one hand there and the other with your pencil like this. And that's not the best way to approach this, especially if you're already falling asleep. So what's the basic approach that we're going to teach you today? Well, there's only 4 steps, really. The first one says read the blurb at the start of each passage. Second, read the passage according to your personal reading style. I'll expand on that. Engage the questions and engage the answers. Okay, so let's talk about the blurb. The blurb is effectively the brief summary located at the beginning of each passage. You should always read it so you have a general idea of the topic. I've given you two examples here. On the left-hand side, passage A is adapted from the essay Justice Side of Byzantium by Ray Bradbury, which is the introduction to a later edition of Bradbury's 1957 novel, Dandelion Wine. Passage B is adapted from Dandelion Wine. Okay? The other side, this passage is from Lydia Minatoya, The Strangeness of Beauty. The setting is Japan in 1920. Chi and her daughter Naomi are members of the House of Fuji, a noble family. You must read these blurbs because it puts you in some kind of focus as to what style this passage is going to be about and a general idea of what's happening. Okay? Look at the right-hand side where it says Chi and her daughter Naomi. That's important. I happen to know that in this passage there are literally 3 characters only, and it's already identified for you 2 of them and the relationship that they have. Let's also be honest that for some of these passages, just like this one I'm showing you, Naomi is a little bit easier to kind of engage. But Chi, you see Akira in the first passage there, sometimes the names are not conventional Western or Americanized names. And it becomes very, very difficult to keep track of who's speaking. Another way that benefits you by reading the blurb is that when they give you fictional passages, they're usually what, 200 years old, okay? And one of the things that's very difficult about 200, 100-year-old passages is that they were usually written to be recited in a play. Why? Because they didn't have TV back then. The internet did not exist. There were no cell phones when Shakespeare was around, okay? So when the writers created these things, it was meant to be spoken word for people to go to a theater, to go to an opera house, and to watch characters speak. So a characteristic of really, really old fictional writing is that it'll give you passages in which there are conversations. And most of you high school students know what I'm talking about. And the conversations are so difficult to keep track of, also because you just have no idea who the heck is talking, right? So even if there's only 2 participants, sometimes you're confused. Was it the governor who is still talking, or was it the police officer who's still talking at this point, right? So reading the blurb helps to set the scenario, if you will. Outside knowledge is not usually super helpful. Okay, so for example, there was this passage I remember that they were doing from a Don Quixote, right? And one of my students had actually done a couple of weeks project on his particular character in that book. There were like 1 or 2 things that sort of helped, especially in displaying the type of attitude that character has. But for the most part, again, outside knowledge is not usually super helpful. And let me tell you why. These standardized tests are designed so that they are supposed to be as fair as possible to whomever is going to take them. Obviously, first of all, you need to be able to read and speak English, okay, which can be a crutch for people who don't know whose first language is not English to begin with. That said, it has to be fair to everybody taking it. So it's not necessarily going to give an advantage to one school or school district who, if that school district basically focuses on a lot of passages that the SAT or ACT might pull from, that would be too much of an advantage versus for somebody else. And the nature of the questions is that you're not supposed to have this immense knowledge or background of it. You're supposed to be able to decipher the correct answers right then and there, albeit with time pressure. So after you read the blurb, you of course have to read the passage. The question I put up here is, what kind of reader are you? Now, let me be clear about this, guys. Even in listening to this webinar, as you do more research, as you guys sort of encounter different tutors, different classes out there, different philosophies, for something as subjective as reading, you're going to hear different people describe it in many different ways. You're also going to have philosophies that sometimes seem like they're conflicting with one another. So our job here is not to present every single one, but I'm just giving you a general approach to this whole thing. We might use different ways to describe techniques as well, but sometimes they boil down to the same type of stuff. Okay, so that said, let me give you guys some idea of how you might want to read this passage. So by asking yourself, what kind of reader are you? I'm going to go ahead and separate you guys into 3 different categories. Okay, so the first category of reader is the type of student who gets A's in pretty much every English or literature class that he or she has ever taken. This is the kind of person who actually likes to read, possibly loves to read, actually has still what might be considered old-fashioned, but a library card, and still actually goes to the library to borrow books. And even if that's not the case, it might be digital. This person might have a Kindle or an Amazon Kindle account and actually purchases either free or paid for books and reads for pleasure. Okay, so not just the books that are given out in school. So that type of reader, if that is you, then you are absolutely the kind of person who should read the whole thing. Those types of readers are usually much faster in the way they engage things, and they can read, again, the entire thing. Okay? And if you're only taking 1 to 2 minutes to read it confidently, then rest assured that is you. The second type of reader, okay, is somebody who probably averages B's and C's in English classes and literature classes and possibly even history classes. Okay, all 3 of those subjects have a direct correlation with reading. Okay, that type of student is not necessarily engaged too much in terms of the reading for pleasure. It kind of just gets by with the passages or the books that are assigned in school. If that sounds like you, then instead of trying to read the whole thing, you might want to try a technique in terms of skimming the passages. Now, there are many different ways to do this. So for some people, it's simply just kind of using your eyeballs to glide along without actually engaging all of your brain as you're doing it. That would be one way to do it. Another way, if you wanted something very strict, you might try to read the first sentence, Akira came directly, breaking all tradition, and the last sentence, would she have been more, had he followed form, had he asked his mother, blah, 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 blah. And you read the first and last sentence of each paragraph. I've heard an infinite number of ways to skim the passage, but the idea is simply that you're not necessarily mentally engaging every single word. The third type of student, heck, doesn't even know what English class he or she is in. Possibly doesn't even know the name of the teacher, okay? Thinks reading is for fools and believes that like the English language should be limited to only 140 characters or it's got to have a hashtag in front of it, okay? If that describes you, for some of you, you may not even need to read the whole thing or at all. And here's why, and this can be a little bit controversial. Some tutors will tell you, no, we believe that every student should absolutely put eyes on this thing. But I can counter that by saying, if I have a tester who spends time reading this, quote unquote reading this, which means they're just using their eyeballs to look at it and nothing is happening in their brain. They're literally just going through the motion and the hamster inside the head is not moving. It's asleep at the wheel, okay? If that is the case, then my argument is that that reader has just wasted valuable time on this with absolutely zero to no benefit, okay? So you have to be honest with yourself depending on what type of reader you are, okay? And you can look at your history, your personal behavior, the grades that you've received, and possibly even the type of test score that you're getting if you took a practice exam, okay? Next one, okay? So once you've made it past the blurb and you've decided to read the passage in your own personal way, we suggest that you identify the questions that you are going to see. Remember what I said before. You have the ability to do the passages in the order that makes better sense to you, leading off with the topics and genres that you are far more comfortable with. And then at the same time, beneath that, you don't have to attack the questions in the same order given to you, 1 through 10, 11 through 20. You can actually pick and choose your way and choose your battles with the easier questions first. So as I mentioned here, questions with line numbers can be the easiest to solve for one obvious reason. They tell you exactly where to go. So duh, okay? So here's some examples of questions with line numbers I'm showing to you. And obviously, a very easy way to look at this is to just see that line 32 for question 9, line 9 for question 6, and lines 74 to 76 for question 27, okay? For question 10, I will spotlight that later on, but it's a specific type of a question that's actually new to the SAT since March of 2016, okay? So use the line numbers, and you might want to attack those first because, again, they tell you exactly where to go.
Hey, Alan, just got something in on the chat, just an interesting thought. Just want to have your take. What if you love to read, but you're an average student? From TJ. What would you say?
Okay, great question, TJ. So what if you love to read, okay, but you're an average student? So that's where, of course, the bridge between those two is not always clear. And that's certainly a situation that I encounter over and over again. So to be clear, I didn't mean to imply that there was just one way for that combination to work. So for your specific scenario, I would say then that if you love to read, then you're probably the kind of student who can manage to try to read the whole thing and then go to the questions. The fact that you're an average student might be indicative of other things you're not able to live up to in school. For example, homework, participation, getting along with other students, like that kind of thing, right? So there's many things that encompass a grade in and of itself, okay? So I would say try it out first with reading the whole thing and see how it matters in terms of your speed and, most importantly, your output, okay?
I want to stress that again too, Alan. Make sure you guys had listened what Alan said there. He's suggesting that, TJ, to maybe read the whole passage. The only way to know if that's going to work for you is to practice it, not once, multiple times, take full-length practice tests and seeing if that strategy works for you. Being an average student, if somehow you read the passage and you can't get through the questions because it's taking you too long, again, you might love to read, but you take your time reading, that's not going to work on a time test. So again, part of it is take what we say, put it into practice, and it may or may not work. So there's multiple ways to approach it. I've had students who they love to read, they're just not very fast at things, and so we take an approach where you read less and you actually, again, personal order of difficulty on the questions and choosing those line reference and the questions they're good at to get more points. So again, a lot of this stuff is you have to take it, put it into practice, and see what works for you, and use that as a strategy.
Wonderful. Yeah, I definitely support and underline everything Anthony said. Remember, guys, especially in this format and the number of people who are listening, not only right now, but will view these and listen to these recordings. If Anthony and I are coaches, let's say for basketball, right? Well, there's no way we can specify how every single one of you should personally get better, right? There's some general strategies that we're giving to you here, and you're going to want to try them out in practice and see what results that you get. Okay, good question. Continue, Anthony, can I do that?
Go on. Yes.
Perfect, thank you. So continuing on with this idea that you can identify the types of questions that are given to you, you have some other questions that we call vocabulary in context, okay? So especially for the SAT, vocabulary until very recently was still a very big deal on that test, okay? And for those of you who are young enough right now to be taking this version of the exam, you should thank your lucky stars that you do not have to deal with the previous versions of the test where your older predecessors, your older relatives, or possibly even your parents had to memorize thousands of vocabulary words in order to improve their test scores. So here, when they test vocabulary, it's going to be the way that it's used in the passage, hence in context. So here's an example, okay? Number 18 says, as it is used in line 19, the phrase paid out most nearly means. Now, I've said this before in my previous webinar. I'll say it one time tonight. Even if you've already solved number 18, that's not the point. I'm trying to show you a process that you can use over and over again so that you can encounter and beat every question that looks like number 18. The purpose is not to solve number 18 and celebrate it. It's to learn how to solve problems just like it. So if you paid attention to what I said before, the first thing I'm actually going to do is, as my eyes read this, instead of bouncing back to the passage, I'm actually going to rephrase the question. What, why, how? I say, what does paid out mean? Unsurprisingly, these types of questions are the easiest ones to rephrase because they're shorter and simpler. Then I go back to line 19 because that's where it tells me to go. So somewhere around here. And when I identify exactly where that vocabulary word or phrase occurs, I will underline, circle, box, star, smiley face, whatever you guys want to do to bring attention to it. So here it says paid out right there. And the entire sentence, of course, says, one naval officer paid out 8 miles, 13 kilometers, of hemp rope from a drifting ship and concluded the sea had no bottom. Now, that entire phrase or sentence may have meant something to some of you, and some of you might have been still been going blank. Okay? What you're supposed to do at this point is you want to create your own word or words to substitute for the original portion. So I put it down there at the bottom, and I blanked out where paid out should have been printed. And so I'm going to ask myself, what can I put in there using my own words or descriptions? And here's one thing I will tell you guys, especially if you're a perfectionist. You do not need to be grammatically correct. It doesn't even need to be in English, okay? It just needs to be something that makes sense to you and obviously makes sense within the context of the passage as well. So I might say, one naval officer let out 8 miles of hemp rope, dropped 8 miles of rope, so on and so forth. To me, that's what makes the most sense. Some of you listening to this might have come up with something even better or even fancier, and that's fine. Okay? So now that I'm there, I take a look at the answer choices, okay? And I compare and contrast. Now, here's the thing. For many people at this point in the process, they think that their only job is to look for the best choice that matches with what you said. Well, that's certainly part of what you're supposed to be doing. It is far better for you to cross off answer choices that you know for a fact do not compare whatsoever. If they're completely wrong, cross them off right away. So I'll give you guys what I believe to be a realistic procedural example here. So I look at these and I go F for dispensed, and if I know what that means, I'm probably going to keep it. I go to G, ascertained. I happen to believe that's the most difficult vocab word here, so for the sake of showing you practicality, I'm going to pretend I do not know what that means. For the record, of course I know what it means, okay? So I don't know what G means. So what do? I'm going to leave it alone. Leave it alone doesn't mean choose it. It doesn't mean cross it off. It means leave it alone and then make an intelligent decision afterwards. Then we go to suggested for answer choice H. I know suggested. I know what that means, and there's no way that means to let out or to be dropped. So what do? I cross it off. Compensated. I'm pretty sure that means to be paid, okay, or given some type of reward for something, and that's definitely not let out. That's definitely not dropped, so I cross that off. Now here's the thing. If this is as far as you get, and you don't know what either F or G mean, and you guess between the two of them, guess what? You still have a 50% chance. That's a flip of a coin, guys. If Anthony and I told the entire world that we could teach you how to just have 2 answer choices instead of 4 for every single problem, we'd be even more popular than we already are now. Okay, so don't poo-poo the idea that you didn't get to 1 answer choice only. 2 is way easier than 4. Excuse me. So if you guess here, good luck to you. You get it right on Monday, you get it wrong on Tuesday. But it's an educated guess. That said, if I'm looking at this thing, I told you originally that I knew what dispensed means. And so for me, dispense means, it reminds me of my generation. It's called a Pez dispenser. I'm not sure most of you know that, but it's this tiny little thing that gives out candy. It has like different heads on it, like superhero heads, Incredible Hulk, Captain America. I'm sure they have Pokemon. I'm sure they have everything else that's for your generation. So a dispenser, right, means something that gives out something. So could this mean that this naval officer was giving out the rope from the drifting ship? I think that's pretty darn close. And even if I don't know the vocab definition of ascertained, I hyper-focus on dispensed. And since I feel pretty good about it, I would effectively choose dispensed, and that would be correct. Let's reverse that. If I knew what dispensed means and it did not match let out or dropped, and I was not that comfortable, I would have to choose answer choice G, which would be an educated guess because I did not know what it means. Okay, so that's just something that I want you guys to kind of understand here. You want to focus on what you know and make your decision that way. You don't want to try to guess what ascertain means, especially if you have no idea in the first place. That's how you get in trouble. You either know it or you don't. You have to be black and white with vocabulary on this test. For the record, ascertain means to determine something, right? So she ascertained that her husband was not home yet because his car was not in the driveway, right? So she determined that he was not home yet. So what about for the questions that do not tell you where to go? Obviously, you're going to see quite a few of these as well. You want to look for indicator words that allow you to search for them as you skim, or even if you remember portions that you've read from the passage. So as an example, for number 25, it says the author's main purpose of including the information about X-ray evidence and density is to. So for me, X-ray evidence and density are very specific words, okay? Not only to this question, but obviously to how I'm going to skim the passage. So now I know I'm looking for portions of the passage that discuss X-ray evidence and density. Don't forget, of course, that I would still have to rephrase this incomplete statement. So instead of engaging it the way that it's normally written, I might say, what are the author's purposes, or what is the author's, right? What is the author's main purpose in including this information? Okay. Number 13 at the bottom, the authors indicate that people value gift giving because they feel it, right? Another incomplete statement. I don't like the way that looks, so I will change it, okay? Instead of saying the authors indicate that people value gift giving because they feel it, why do people value gift giving? Notice, guys, I actually didn't even include the word authors there. So you have an infinite number of ways to do this. Just use what, why, or how. So here for me, it's the value gift giving thing that's very specific. So now you know that you're looking for portions of the passage that discuss why people value gift giving. So that's exactly what I'm looking for. Obviously, you wouldn't be looking for the word author or people or that or it, okay? So you're looking for unique, long words that allow you to skim the passage or remember portions you might have seen those words. Some more questions. So here is something that is specific to the SAT. As I mentioned before, these types of questions actually arrived in March 2016, so it's something new. It's a twist that they put there, okay? So some questions on the SAT are paired with each other, and it's kind of obvious to see what that means. So question 13 asks you a question, and then question 14 refers back to the previous question and says which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question. Okay, so how do you attack these ones? First of all, you of course attack the first question, and if you have a relatively easy time making your choice and finding what you believe to be the correct answer, the second question should be even easier. So if I felt as if answer choice D is my choice for number 13, and I felt pretty darn confident about that, right? It wasn't a guess whatsoever. I can then easily do number 14 because where I found the evidence for answer choice D is going to absolutely be one of these things. And that's going to be very easy for me to understand. Why? Again, I've already answered number 13. But what if I have a more difficult time? So sometimes the pairing, the very first question, will not be that easy for you to engage. In fact, you might be looking at it, scratching your head, despite using the techniques, going, I'm still not quite sure what to do. If that occurs, then you want to actually reverse this process and use the answers in the second question to help you find a place to start. We know that these two are intrinsically connected to each other. They are pairs, they are partners. So the test is literally telling you one of these four in the second question is going to help answer and support the previous one. Hence, if you have a difficult time with number 13, jump straight to 14, and then use these to actually back solve. You want to go back and look at where these lines occur and see which ones make sense and, most importantly, support one of the answers to number 13. Okay? It's a good way to do those. Questions to save for last. Okay? So here, again, it comes with a lot of practice. Imagine that you've already engaged the majority of the questions. You've taken care of the ones that give you the line numbers and where to go. You've taken care of the ones with vocabulary and context. You've taken care of the rest that don't have line numbers. But how would you identify the ones to actually skip and say, no, thank you, I'm going to leave you for last because I know you're a very difficult type of question, or you're the type of question that is designed to take up as much time as possible. Okay? So the way that you would do that is, if you take a look, first of all, you should certainly be in a better position to answer these types of questions because you've already tackled other problems, and in theory, you've already read significant portions of the passage by the time you get here. But what you are trying to basically avoid are the types of questions that, for example, compare authors' perspectives. Okay? You definitely want to save those for last because that requires knowledge of each author's perspectives and how they compare or contrast. If you look at question number 28 isn't necessarily asking about each author, but it might as well be because it's saying both passage A and passage B. So now you have to effectively engage both passages as a whole, and you have to answer with a compare or contrast style question. Other types of questions to save for last would include any question that has a capitalized set of words, such as except, not, or least. So it might say, which of the following is the least acceptable portrayal of the author's thesis? And they will capitalize the word least, or except, or not. Those types of questions take up a lot of time because you are effectively trying to engage 4 different answer choices, and only one of them is going to be the correct answer to that question. And even though that is still technically true for every single reading question here, the style and the rhetoric of those types of questions suck you in and basically force you to have to search almost like a needle in a haystack for 4 different random statements. So that's why we try to stay away from those as much as possible, and we save them for last. Remember this, and this is true for every part of the test besides the reading section. All of the questions are worth the same number of points. Okay? So there are no moral victories if you solve the harder reading question versus the easy one. I would much rather that you guys focus your time and energy on the first several easy style questions and then save for last the really difficult ones. They're worth the same number of points. Okay? So keep that in the back of your mind.
Alan, I got a question, and then I wanted your opinion on something too. A couple things. So, one is you're saying save those for last, and would you? And I talked about this in the first session too. Is for some students that I've tutored, I don't even have them attempt those questions. So, for example, except not least for the slow reader, not a great scorer, those. I want you to get the easy questions and make sure you're accurate on those. And the math, whether it's math, reading, or whatever, that they would not even attempt the question, meaning read it. They would still bubble an answer, but they wouldn't even have the time to do it. So we don't even attempt them.
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts on that philosophy?
I agree with that, Anthony. So Anthony's speaking to a very specific type of student or a type of result, I should say, right? So especially if you're somebody who is struggling in both areas. If you're struggling in accuracy, that's one thing. If you're struggling on timing, that's another. They don't always go hand in hand, by the way, okay? So if you're struggling in both, even despite the fact that you're, let's say, studying frequently or getting some tutoring or whatever the case might be, you're actually preparing for this test, but you're not seeing the results that way. Without actually meeting with you in person, obviously, I would say that type of advice would be very helpful because it relieves a lot of the pressure and takes some of the energy away that you would have to distribute to the hardest type of questions. But as Anthony just said, remember, don't forget to put a guess down regardless, right? So you would want to do that. There are definitely some students that I would personally counsel to say, listen, you know what? Until we've proven you are better at this and you can level up, let's just kind of stay away from these questions to begin with, okay? So what I'm saying right now is in the last couple of minutes that I've talked about this particular slide, it's not describing that type of student, obviously. So this is a student who has the ability to engage all the questions, but save these for last.
All right, great answer. Okay, so then the question for you, one came up on the Q&A, but I'm going to make it a bigger question. They were asking about paired questions on the ACT. Are there? No, but my question is, what are some of the similarities or differences in the types of questions, SAT versus ACT? Are they going to look very similar? How are they a little different, to just give folks an idea?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, paired questions, unless the ACT decides to change it overnight, which it certainly can, right? They can do almost any weird thing they want to. Right now, no. Paired questions do not occur with any frequency or consistency on the ACT. Anthony, unless you've heard otherwise, feel free to tell me I'm wrong on that.
No, you're correct. There's no paired on ACT.
Okay. And then secondly, as far as comparing, contrasting them as a whole, right? So first of all, appreciate the fact that reading is subjective, but it's kind of interesting to see that for the most part, the styles of questions that each of them is asking is going to be it's going to be about the same, except for, like I just said, paired questions, which only occur on the SAT. There's a philosophical difference that I see between the two of them. It's not related to the types of passages. There is a difference in how frequently they test each genre. So the ACT and the SAT, and I will launch into it here, but you could predict how many of each type of genre you're going to get. Okay, just get your hands on a practice ACT or SAT, and you guys do have access to it, and you'll see that's a cadence that repeats. Okay, they like to do that. So for the ACT, if it's fiction first, it'll be followed up by like history right away or science or something like that. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing to think about is that philosophically, they have very different roots here. So the ACT was always seen as a test that looks and feels like a high school-based exam. Hence, anecdotally, if you were a good student in high school and you had all the good habits of a good student, you historically performed better on the ACT. The SAT historically and philosophically was more like a puzzle or a riddle, okay? And so it tended to reward students who thought that way, who like to play role-playing games online, who play Sudoku or crossword puzzles, or understand the phrase "poning noobs 24/7." Only a few of you understood that. If that's you, you're probably SAT brained. How does that relate to the reading section? Because on the SAT, more so than the ACT, you could try to find the incorrect answer choices by identifying keywords that the SAT would never allow to be correct. And we traditionally would call those extreme answer choices. That's more prevalent on the SAT. I'll give you an example. They cannot be words that are too inclusive or exclusive. Examples would be everyone, no one, forever, all the time, should be, so on and so forth. So what does that mean? If you see answer choices, especially on the SAT, that include those types of words, it's probably not correct. I'll give you a short, simple example. If there is an answer choice on SAT reading that states, doctors are the smartest people on earth, the SAT would never designate that as the correct answer. Because if word got out that that was an answer choice that the SAT approved, then they might get an email or a phone call or a text or a Snapchat, right, or a Twitter DM or whatever it is, from a rocket scientist saying, I'm a rocket scientist, and I just heard that you guys said doctors are the smartest people on earth. Well, I'm a rocket scientist, and I happen to be smarter than those people. There's kind of a simple, weird example, but it should stick in your heads that way. So those are just some of the things that I would say as far as compare and contrast. But if you saw them, in my experience, they're going to look very similar and kind of feel very similar. Okay. Any other questions, Anthony?
No, that's it right now.
Okay, perfect. So again, in this particular case, being able to identify questions that take up way more time than necessary, save those for last, okay? And you might actually find personally that there's this type of question that you just don't like. See, traditionally, I and many other tutors will say that the questions about vocabulary are some of the easier ones, so do them first. There are absolutely students who might say, actually, no, I have a very hard time with vocabulary, especially, let's say, if you're an ESL kid, right? So that being said, you might leave those for last yourself. That's personal order of difficulty, which I know Anthony introduced. Okay, alrighty. So when you're actually engaging these questions, right, and then going back to the passage, how much are you actually supposed to read? And that's why we call this necessary reading. So let me be very clear, okay? You could never, theoretically, you could never read too much, but you certainly have to be smart, okay? Why is that? Because you are being timed. So I'm certainly not suggesting that you read the whole passage again. So maybe I'm arguing against my own phrasing here. You can read a little too much, okay? So let me show you an example of what I would do. For number 11, okay, it says the authors most likely use examples in lines blah, 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 okay, of the passage to highlight the, and of course what you would in theory do is rephrase, okay, so I might say, why do the authors use those examples, or what are the authors trying to highlight? Two different ways to say that, many, many more ways to say that. What, why, how. So I'm engaging this, and it tells me, of course, that I need to look at the examples in lines 1 to 9. And on the left-hand side, it tells me, and I highlighted there, or they're bracketed, where the question says I'm supposed to look. So I read that quietly to myself. I'm going to speed along here, and just if you're watching this, you can just pause it and read it to yourself, okay? But what I would suggest is actually to read a little bit more. Notice, of course, a couple of things. Number one, where we are starting is literally the first part of the first paragraph, so you can't go any further back than that. So you have to start with every day. But instead of stopping at the word showers, which would be a very lazy way to do this, I would read a few more complete sentences, and I might even go as far as ending with bonds with one's closest peers. That's what I mean by you could never read too much. It's really just a couple of sentences more. If you want to put a number to it, we might say read 3 to 5 lines above and 3 to 5 lines below where you're supposed to be searching, and remember to read complete sentences. That's what you're supposed to do, okay? So obviously, again, you're going to repeat this process over and over depending on the types of questions that you see. And what about the next step from that? So we're still in the same passage here, okay? So what is being highlighted by the authors, or why do the authors use those examples? So looking at it right now, okay, and I highlighted that portion also. And the reason I underlined that sentence is to show you that if I had only stuck to exactly the line numbers and the words that the question asked me to do, I might have missed this statement, which helps to encapsulate, it helps to wrap up everything that's discussed here, okay? So in this particular passage, it talks about how Americans spent over $30 billion at a retail stores in the month of December alone, and that's millions of shoppers, as it said in the previous sentence. Aside from purchasing holiday gifts, most people regularly buy presents for other occasions throughout the year, including weddings, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and baby showers. This frequent experience of gift giving can engender ambivalent feelings in gift givers. If you don't know what engender or ambivalent mean, you can ignore them for the time being. If you do, then I don't have to explain what they mean at this point, okay? So what you do now is you generate your own response. So for me, in order to answer the question, what do these examples highlight, or why did the authors use all of these examples, such as the weddings, the birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, baby showers, okay? I might say that people give gifts for many different reasons. Guys, do you see how simple I've made that wording? We're not trying to be professorial here. We're not trying to write, the next great American novel. We're just trying to be as clear as possible. Okay? The reason all of those were listed is to show that people give gifts for many different reasons. Now I can go back to the answer choices and compare and more likely contrast. Cross off answer choices that are definitely nowhere near what I'm trying to say. So I look here, and what would I do? I cross off those two. Okay, let me show you again. A recent increase in the amount of money spent on gifts. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's not it. They said 30 billion up there, but this isn't about how much more money people are spending. Answer choice C, anxiety gift shopping causes for consumers. Well, that's very real, especially for somebody like me, but that's not really, I don't believe that's why they discuss all of these things. So I'm left with these two. And just to sort of mimic the real testing experience, I'm still stuck with two, just like many of you might be. Answer choice A says regularity with which people shop for gifts. Answer choice D says number of special occasions involving gift giving. So how can I make a decision between these two, especially if on the surface they both seem like they might be okay? There's some subtle differences between them, so let me point that out. Okay, so here's a blow up of that. Effectively, I can try to choose the answer choice that makes the best sense for me, or almost always I should try to identify the answer choice that is probably even a little bit wrong. Okay, this is kind of like a true-false quiz, guys. Remember, there's one rule in true-false quizzes. If any part, even one word of the statement is false, it has to be false. And that's something that they have built into these answer choices so that they can justify why one is better or worse than the other. So I'm going to highlight something that I would be asking myself here. So they talked about all these different occasions, right? So again, birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, so on and so forth. So the question I ended up asking myself here was, is this really about the number of special occasions, right? Is this a passage that's discussing and just wants to effectively list all the different reasons people actually want to give gifts? Well, if you've taken any practice or real SATs or ACTs before, you know that they're fans of kind of like a deeper meaning behind some of this stuff, right? You're not reading The Great Gatsby in high school just so that you can understand what it means to be lonely and rich, right? That's not it. You're not reading Lord of the Flies just so that you can understand what happens when boys are trapped on an island by themselves. There's sort of an agenda behind that. There's a theme. So I find myself saying, no, I don't think this is really about the number of special occasions, as if they just want to tell us, here's all the reasons that you want to buy a gift, okay? So what sounds more like an SAT-style response is regularity with which people shop for gifts. And therefore, I would cross off D. I would choose answer choice A. Don't be disappointed if you thought it was the other one as well, or even one of the other two. Hopefully, you didn't think it was B or C, okay? But remember, you're also missing the full experience of seeing this because you're listening to me, you're trying to absorb my lecture, and this is not something that's going to seem too obvious for you. If you got it from the beginning, kudos to you, but pay more attention to the process that we're trying to teach you here. Practice, okay? So some reminders about what you should do to get better. The first one is obvious. Access the drills and practice tests through CUSD-Futureology. You should all have access to those Google Docs. Read more when you can. That's kind of obvious as well. And just to be very clear and contemporary here, yeah, Instagram and Snapchat, they don't count, right? 1 or 2 words with hashtags in front of them, not reading. And finally, to be very specific, try to read newspaper editorials. If you get a newspaper at your house, okay, that's fine. If you don't, you can just access them online. And newspaper editorials are typically at the opinion side, okay? So the opinion-based articles are what you're trying to go through, okay? They have a direct correlation with the types of and the cadence of passages that you will see on these tests. And now I'm ready for any more questions if there are any.
Okay, everybody, have some questions coming in. Why don't we do that? And Anything about the reading, or even if you have a quick question about last Wednesday on the math while I'm here. But for the most part, let's try to focus on reading questions. Put them in the Q&A.
And Anthony, just in case you might have to look for me, I've for some reason I've lost the controls to the to seeing the chat stuff. So
okay, no problem.
Actually, let me see here. Q&A. Yeah, I don't see any open questions there. Okay.
I've been answering the questions as they come in. If they were
Thank
just,
you. Yeah. No, I see it now, but it looks like there are no questions at this point.
let them come in, guys. You got Alan's not joining us again. So if there was a question from his last session as well, now's a good time to ask him. Obviously, his email's on the board, so you could reach out to him directly. All right, Alan, here's a question. Somebody's asking about, you know, I'm an average scorer, and, you know, on reading, should I do all the passages? Do I skip any passages and answer? How would I approach that?
Okay. Okay, good question. Now, first of all, let me be honest that it's very difficult to answer such a specific question in a very general format, right? What I mean by that is I've never sat down with this student, and I've never seen the student perform, and I don't even know what average means for this student, but that's okay. So I'll just assume a few things. So an average tester would be around 500 points for each section of the SAT, or around 21 points for any section or the reading in this particular case, right? And then at the same time, if the question is, should that type of student be skipping any passages, here's the best way to try to answer that. There's what they call a raw score conversion chart that exists for both test types. And I believe that's actually even included in the practice test on the Futureology, right, Anthony? Because if they have the ability to score their own tests, that is included there.
Yeah, they have the ability through the SAT, there's answer choices, as well as on the ACT. You guys have the ability to take a test, score it yourself, and you basically are counting up your correct answers in a conversion chart and scrolling over from your raw score to your scaled score.
Okay, perfect. Well, then that's very, very helpful in the way I'm going to answer this question. So that conversion chart is helpful for more than just for your information or scoring your tests. You could use it to see what progress you need in order to determine how many questions you need to get correct versus questions you might get wrong, okay? So you can look at that conversion chart and effectively ask yourself, well, if I'm at 500, and if your realistic goal is, let's say, 600, you could check how many questions you absolutely have to get correct to get in the range of 600 points. And then you can ask yourself, well, how does that compare to the total number of questions that I can actually engage? Always leave yourself some leeway. If you're supposed to get 50 questions correct, don't only attempt 50 questions. That would be 100% accuracy, right? So in this kind of format, that's the best way I can answer that. If you want me to be a bit more detailed, please reach out to me separately so that I can really guide you through, okay? That's the best way I can answer that.
Okay, great. Got another question here. Do you lose more, and I'll answer this one, do you lose more points for answering a question wrong or leaving it blank, or does it not matter? So for this anonymous person, that's the question we don't want to hear at this point in time, because we've been answering it along the way. You don't lose any points for getting something wrong. You should always pick an answer. And as Alan pointed out, even tonight, every question is worth the same. You don't get more points for getting something that's harder, or you don't get something that's really easy. It's all equal points. So you're always going to bubble something in. Let's get that out of the way, because if some of you are already confused in that, you always bubble an answer. What we're talking more about is whether you actually attempt one, depending on where you're scoring, and that's going to be very individualistic. So based on where you're at and what you're scoring, if you're a 400 math scoring student, you should probably not be attempting every single math question on the ACT, and there's 60 of them, because number 50 and 55 are going to be really, really hard. So answer every question, or actually bubble and answer for every question. You might not attempt every single question, but you'll still bubble and answer. So everything's worth the same on that one.
Yep.
All right, another question for you, Alan. What is the best approach to our narrative passage in the reading session for the ACT?
Okay, so Anish, that's a very specific question here, and pretty much everything that I actually said tonight is going to be applicable. There isn't going to be a severe difference in technique between one genre from the other. What actually separates success among different students and different passage types is where your personal preference happens to be. So there isn't something that's going to be terribly different there. I would say that if you identify the fact that you are weaker at narrative passages, the first thing you're going to want to do is use the same techniques that I've taught here, but to use them on more narrative passages. See, the thing that's difficult about trying to replicate that type of practice is that if you got your hands on 10 SAT or ACT, I should say, 10 ACT practice tests, you really only have like 10 narrative passages there, right? So that's why you're going to have to be a bit more detailed in your search for more of that. There wouldn't be a drastic difference in technique. It's a difference in how your mind absorbs it. But you and I would have to have a more specific conversation about that away from this. So feel free to contact me if that still was sort of a not satisfactory. Yeah.
And then on top of that, it's also, it's not, again, not necessarily the narrative passage, but what questions do you struggle with? What questions do you do well on? What are you currently scoring, and where do you need to go based on some of your goals? All that affects your approach, your pacing, your strategy, and how you take the test. Again, it's hard to say when we don't know where your score is, where you need to go, what you struggle on, what you're really good at. It's going to be different. That approach is going to be tailored to everybody based on where they're at. So again, Anish, you're going to have to start doing some practice, seeing where you're at, and finding out, should I only read the blurb and go right to the questions? All the things that Alan was talking about tonight, use those in your toolbox. As far as what you actually end up using is going to be based on where you're at with all of that. So you got to take that and kind of put it together.
Okay.
All right, here's when reading a passage, I'm slow at understanding what's going on unless I have an interest on that passage. Any other advice besides finding the passages I have interest in first?
Yeah. So thank you for acknowledging the fact that obviously you're going to want to attack those passages you have interest in first. Secondly, let's be realistic. There's no way I can tell you guys or teach you guys, well, you just have to gain interest in those other passages, right? That would be, again, unfair. So while a passage about, let's say, topwater bass fishing lures might be a passage I would completely be interested in, most of you probably would not, or have no idea what the heck I just said. Okay, so other advice that I might say if you're still understanding what's going on is, instead of trying to make yourself be more engaged in the passage, you can be a little bit more robotic about the way that you approach the questions themselves. It's kind of like how surgeons perform their surgery. They're not, they're only focused on the task at hand, as opposed to all of the emotional implications and human implications of what they're doing. So in this particular case, if you are more robotic about it, then you can engage it, and you can start to say to yourself, David, this is simply a vocab and context style question. It doesn't really matter what the title or the topic was. I'm just engaging that. This is simply an implication style question with line numbers to reference it. So I'm really just attacking it that way. That would be one way to do that. And those are instant techniques I'm teaching to you. The mid to long term, and I obviously don't know what grade level you're in and when you're taking your tests, but the long-term way to do that is, frankly, to begin reading more passages and articles you have zero interest in. So just like that slide that I said, in which you read newspaper editorials, most high school students I meet would be very bored with newspaper editorials. Start reading them, because you have to learn how to engage topics that you're not remotely interested in. Finally, David, that's actually a good way to learn more life skills in the future. Guys, when you become adults and professionals, you're going to be in many, many situations that you don't want to be in professionally. That's boring to you, that you would rather sleep as opposed to pretend you're paying attention. Learn that skill now. It's going to come in handy.
That's a good one. And then also with that, David, yeah, who really enjoys the SAT or the ACT? So you're not alone in that. You're just saying on a passage. Well, the test in itself, we don't like it. It's just a hoop you have to jump through. So what I'm going to say to you is, if your goal is to go to a particular college or just to go to college in general, it's a hoop you typically have to jump through, unless you choose a test optional school. So there's about 850 of them. So choose that, and then you don't have to deal with that. Go to a junior college if that's the path. No, and if I'm telling you, well, I don't want to go to a test optional school and I don't want to go to junior college, well, if a four-year university that requires an SAT or an ACT is the goal and that's where you want to go, well, then it's a hoop you have to jump through. And as Al had pointed out, if it's something you have to do, you're just going to have to find a way to do it. What I would use as the motivator is, I want to go to Arizona State, or I want to go to Georgia Tech, or I want to go to Florida, wherever the school it is. That's your goal. So you have to make it happen and find it some way. And just going to go, you know what, these passages or whatever, it's going to be an hour of my time and I'm going to give it my all and deal with it. But I'm going to find all the strategies I need to do to maybe read less and find a way to get through it. Okay. All right. Another question. And when you have to replace a word like the example in ascertained, what is the best option to do if I don't know any of the words given? I mean, we talked about this, guys, the first night, if you attended my global strategies, and we talked about process elimination. And I'll let Alan talk about technique and stuff, but just in general, process elimination. We talked about when we see words in the words in context, that typically it's not your first thought word, actually your first definition of the word. So for example, in the one Alan used tonight, he said paid out. Well, one of the answer choices was compensated, if you remember it. I remember it. That wasn't the answer. When you think paid, you think compensated. So again, if you had nothing else to do, what you want to do is try to eliminate based on things like that. Secondly is, if you don't know what words mean, like Alan pointed out, well, one, you can't eliminate that word. But what you could do is find the roots in the word to find and get a sense of that word. For example, if the word had the mal in it, maladjusted or mal something, you know it was going to be somewhat of a bad word. Well, if you're looking more of a good word, then you can get rid of the bad word. And that's another way when your vocabulary is lacking, is to use kind of words within words and try to get a sense of it. Or, I remember that word being used. I don't know what exactly means, but the way they used it made it seem like it was a really good thing. Well, okay, then note that about the word and use it to your advantage. So those are just some strategies. Alan, I don't know if you have technique stuff that you can kind of layer onto that.
No, I mean, that's basically what I would say as well. Now, there is, of course, a major difference between staring at 4 words and you have no idea what each of them means, versus staring at 4 and knowing at least 1 or 2 of them, right? So you still have more of a fighting chance. Assuming you have even 1 word you know the definition to, hyper focus on that word. Ask yourself if it's something that does or does not make sense within the context of what you're answering, and then cross it off. Let's say if it doesn't work, now you have a 1 out of 3 chance, which is still better than a 1 out of 4 chance. I'll mention one thing though, mid to long term, that students do not do as frequently as I would like them to. So there's natural concern if you're staring at a problem and you don't know the majority of the words, let alone all 4 words, right? But most students will have that a little anxiety, a little freak out about that experience, and then guess what? They don't do anything else past that, and then they repeat that same type of experience over and over again. So what I'm saying is that if you encounter words you don't know the definition to, even after tonight's presentation, you guys have cell phones now. Heck, Anthony and I did not have that, so we had to carry a dictionary. Well, we look for a dictionary, really, and look it up, and then try to commit that to memory and practice it as well. In theory, guys, you actually need to use a new word approximately 20 times in order for it to become part of your regular vocabulary. So while that may not make you more popular with a cool crowd in high school, or maybe it does, that's how you actually learn vocab words. So don't ignore the long game when you encounter words you don't know.
Great. Thanks, Alan. All right. Any last questions before we wrap up? We're hitting our hour and a half. Again, another great session for everybody. Oh, here's another question coming. Before I do that, you'll notice on the syllabus, Wednesday's listed as a practice test. That's just to kind of keep a schedule for you guys. We don't have another session till Sunday. I threw that on Wednesday. It doesn't have to be Wednesday. What I'm telling you, as we've been saying throughout, you've got to do practice. So it's on you. And what I would suggest is, now that you've had a bunch of classes already, 4 to be exact, you should be ready to take a practice test and see where you're at. So you need to get a sense of where you're going, what your goals are, and what you need to do for the rest of the program or beyond. So that's why I have it in there. You should pull up one of the practice test links, go for it, score it yourself. And as we're talking about tonight, if you have a 25 ACT, and maybe or 25 in reading, well, how am I going to get to 27 reading? How many more questions do I need to get right? You can look all that stuff up. So I'm mentioning that again, is it's on you guys to do the drills and the practice test. Before you maybe do the full-length practice test, as I said in my class on Wednesday, is to do just a section of just math. Do just a section of English. Do just a section of reading and writing and language for the SAT. So do sections only, and then you've had some drills under your belt, do a full-length test. Take your score and see where you're at that moment. Okay, and if you're not where you need to be, then you got to put some more work into. So that's what the syllabus says is a practice test, but it's for Wednesday. It could be Thursday, it could be Saturday, whenever you want it to be. I was just trying to give you some structure into the program. Okay. All right, let's see what else we have here. What was that new word we learned from that question today?
I think if you're referring to ascertained, right? I'm not suggesting that it wasn't focused on that word. It was just to kind of pretend that I might be somebody who doesn't know what that word means. So that said, ascertain is to determine something, right? Like, what are you able to conclude once you've put the clues together? So I believe that was it.
Okay, great. Another question in anonymous, and I'll answer this. I mean, it's just I'm not that kind of a reader who reads the whole passage because it takes me too long. Okay, great that you're noticing that about yourself. And when I skim, you sound like me. I don't understand what the passage was about. Sounds like me when I was in high school. What should you do? Now, here I'm going to give you what you should do. It's not something that I did. Well, then if you have that problem, go right to the questions. Okay, read the blurb, which gives you an idea of the passage. Go right to the questions. As Alan pointed out tonight, doing line reference questions first are important because it points you to a line. Then you go read that and read that for that scope, for that question. And before you know it, when you do a bunch of line reference questions, you're going to know what the passage was about. It's going to help you. So when you get that main idea question that you skipped over first because it's a general question, and you come back to it later, what was the main idea of the passage? You're going to know from doing 4 line reference questions or lead word questions, and before you know it, you'll get it. And that's takes practice, though. You have to know to do which questions first, finding line reference, finding lead words, and then you'll get an idea of what the passage was about. So if that's what type of test you are, and I was tutoring and I figured that out about you, that's kind of what we would do in a nutshell. But again, as we're pointing out, go practice it and see if that works better for you than what you were currently doing. Okay, so again, I was there. I just kept doing that, and it didn't work for me. But I never changed it, and I didn't find a new way to do it. Okay, and that's what you have tonight. So if you need to re-watch it again, I highly suggest you doing that, and then go put some of those things into practice. Great question, though. All right, we're going to wrap up on that. Again, you have Alan's email. It's reach out to him, alan@politoprep.com. You have my email as well. Reach out to me. But thank you again for another session. I'm going to stop the recording.